We are here in the end of Deuteronomy chapter 3. For our guests who we warmly welcome this morning, we're going through an expository series on the book of Deuteronomy. Have been for coming up on 3 months now nearly. And we're here at the end of chapter 3, finishing off this particular chapter where we have a bit of a spoiler. We had read to us earlier in the liturgy, as you will have noticed, Deuteronomy chapter 34, which is the last chapter. So if that spoiled the movie for anyone, sorry. Moses passes away, ta-da. And for those who were wondering, no, Moses did not write the part where he passes away. That is written by someone later on, particularly after the generation of Joshua, that ties into at least the opening portion of that chapter, where Moses is yet to pass away here. What we have is perhaps one of the first or most obvious and apparent recounting on Moses' part as to just where actually we are in the story of redemptive history and in the history of the nation. This really illuminates to us, by virtue of Moses going up upon the mountain, being shown the promised land by God, how close we actually are in the ending of Moses' life, because it is not long after this that he then passes away. This is what really frames for us and gives us an immediate kind of recognizable moment that this is effectively, the book of Deuteronomy that is, the proverbial last testimony to the Israelites on the part of Moses. He is right at the end of his life, and part of that is then obviously explained here of his going up upon the mountain and being given this great grace and mercy on the part of God, which we'll go on to explore as we go through this passage. And then as Deuteronomy chapter 34 then recounts to finish off, it then accounts for then Moses passing away, and then similar to what we have here in terms of its details. But we have within this morning's text a number of things that will really encourage us. This should be a very encouraging passage that provide for us some very insightful cross-references into the New Testament, especially regarding hope and faith, which of course for us are very much intertwined and tied theologically to one another. And we'll see that as we work our way through these verses here at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 3. So let's begin in verse 23. I also pleaded with Yahweh at that time, saying, O Lord Yahweh, you have begun to show your slave your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Now the rhetorical answer to that rhetorical question is indeed none. This is here Moses explaining and indeed proclaiming the great glories and wonders of God. This is what we would call a doxology. For those who remember our series on doxology earlier this year, on worship and the proclamation of God's doxos, his glory. This here is a form of a doxology or of a glory. O Lord Yahweh, you have begun to show me, your slave, your servant, the one who was your slave, was the slave of Egypt, who is now indeed a slave of you, the one who is the leader of the people who were enslaved to pagans and to tyrants and to those who perpetrate evil in the world, to those who abuse and those who torture and those who kill, but who are now enslaved to the one who brings life and light and glory and hope. It is to I, your slave, whom you have demonstrated your greatness and your strong hand, your mighty works. You can also more figuratively translate that as your great and wondrous deeds, all the things that I, for all of this time now, for 80 years, have been able to know and to see and to understand, going all the way back to the events that we have in my encounter with you, in this famed event in the burning bush in the land of Midian, where you revealed to me that you are the great I am. You are Chayer Aser Chayer. I am who I am. I am the self-existent one. I am the one who exists in and of himself. I am the very source of all being. And from this point forward, I am the one who will indeed redeem, literally rescue my people from slavery in the land of Egypt. That word that which we find obviously replete throughout the New Testament, salvation or redemption, really is a redeeming, it's a paying of the price, it is a purchasing. And so this is why this kind of phraseology, especially in this case a self-description on the part of the prophet Moses as a slave, is so apt. he indeed, even though he was a prince of Egypt, was nonetheless, as part of his people, as part of Israel, was indeed enslaved to darkness. They were enslaved to the Egyptian gods. That's why they had such great difficulty, of course, separating themselves from that all the way through the book of Numbers and back into Exodus as well as through Leviticus. And we've had that, of course, recounted to us, particularly in chapter 2. But here now, this slave, not of darkness or of evil, of chaos, but rather of good and of light and of life and of hope, glorifies God for having redeemed him. Having redeemed him. And it's not just singular, by the way. Whenever you're reading of Moses, you really should be reading it in the context in which leaders speak. True leaders do not speak in isolating terms. They don't speak as just merely the individual, and Moses doesn't do that either. When he speaks, it's in a corporate sense. When he speaks of himself, I myself, your slave, he is speaking as the prophet of Israel. He is the mouthpiece of God to the people, and on the flip side, he is the mouthpiece of the people to God. Do you understand? There is this mediatory work, this mediational work. He is the mediator between God and man. And this is what the great leaders and prophets of the people are throughout the Old Testament. And as we work our way through, we see the way in which the leaders of Israel, especially in the form of the kings and the high priests, serve as mediators between the people and God. All of them, like Moses himself, of course, perhaps most famously Moses, on the prophetic side or the religious side, and then on the princely or the political side, King David himself. So you have the political and the religious, foreshadowing whom? The one who would be indeed our true high priest, our King of Kings, the one who is a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, according to the author of the book of Hebrews. This one who stands forever as high priest, who makes intercession once and for all of his people, who literally in himself is the true and ultimate reconciliation between God and between man. Not in some vague esoteric sense, but in the true corporeal, material sense, as well as the spiritual. He himself, Christ our Lord, unites both God and man in his very person. We've talked about this, of course, many times. This is what we call the hypostatic union, the union of Christ, fully man, fully God, as we proclaim even in the Nicene Creed, God of God, right? Truly God, truly man. Uniting in himself and in his person, singular, the fullness of humanity, perfect in nature, with the fullness of the divine, the fullness of deity, in whom he bodily dwelt. This is the mediatory role. And Moses here is one of these figures which foreshadows this. He's what's called a type. Okay, so a typology is one who is an image of what is to come. Does that make sense? Here Moses is one of the greatest examples of this. We'll see him appear later by the time we get through some of our cross-references here this morning to the New Testament. But he says in this doxology that your great and your strong hand, your mighty hand, has been made known to us. For indeed what God is there in heaven or upon the earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Yahweh has conclusively demonstrated even by this point to the Israelites that the pantheon of Egypt, the great and mighty deities feared around the world by all of Egypt's enemies, are but naught, are but nothing, okay? Real, but whose power has been utterly destroyed, who have been demonstrated to be inferior, who has been conquered, particularly and especially through the 10 plagues of Egypt, which if we were to go through that as a sermon series, you would see the various different Egyptian deities who were responsible for various different areas of Egyptian culture and life and religiosity, who were attacked by Yahweh in that sense, and who were defeated. It's an unfamiliar concept to us in our modern day, but in the ancient world this was very similar, very familiar. Nations went to war against each other, and whilst there was the natural kind of physical war going on, which is obviously very important, which required resources, which required tactics and strategies and planning and command and control, all of the nations knew that really what the true battle was the battle between our gods, especially our patron god, our national god, against the gods of our enemies and against their patron god. Okay? And so when Babylon goes to war, Marduk marches forth, the national or patron god of Babylon. Okay? That's what you have. There is the physical war and there is the spiritual war. For anyone who's familiar with the Iliad, the famous epic poem from ancient Greece, from the end of what we call Mycenaean Greece or Bronze Age Greece, written by Homer eventually later on in the year BC 800. The Greek invasion of Troy, and the famous battle with figures like Odysseus and Achilles and Hector and other such famous figures. Really, when you read the Iliad, as much as the human element is there, the Iliad primarily is about the battle between the gods. The various Greek gods who chose to side with the Achaeans, the Greeks, versus those who sided with Troy. This is the framework or the world view of the ancient world. Okay? And in fact, it's been the world view of most people throughout history. Here, with the Israelites, to our surprise in our modern secular day, this isn't actually an exception to the rule. This is actually simply the greatest example of that very principle. Because Yahweh speaks often through the prophets about his victory over these lesser gods, over these gods lowercase g plural. And this is no exception. He has demonstrated his great wonders and his great and mighty acts. And this is why later on, some nearly 1,000 years after this particular time period, through Jeremiah, this one who is watching the conquest of Judea at the hands and the might of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the New Babylon. In chapter 10, he flips, having of course been speaking in Hebrew, he flips in, I believe, verse 11 off memory of Jeremiah chapter 10, into Aramaic, the language of the nations, the language of the pagans, and says that all the gods who have come forth from the heavens and the earth, that is to say, all the gods who did not create the heavens and the earth, will be crushed upon the earth and beneath the heavens. We've explained plenty of times before, but to remind you, the consistent pagan belief, universal, literally, ubiquitous pagan belief, is that their deities came forth from the creation, not the other way around. Okay? That's why Genesis 1 is so important. It's why it's written in the way that it is. It's why it's structured in that kind of form. It's an apologetic, well, it's many things, but one of them is that it's an apologetic. It's an explanation that, no, this is not a God who came forth from the creation, who did not come forth from this primordial, what was almost always the same case, Sky Father, Earth Mother. No, this is the very God who made the heavens and the earth. There's an extremely specific reason why the beginning of Genesis chapter 1 is written the way it is. Okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That there immediately flips the entire common ancient understanding right on its head. Do you see? This is not the God who came forth from primordial creation. This is the one who created primordial creation, the one who is eternal, the one who comes before all that has been made. This is the unique, the one, the only. This is the creator of all things. This is the one in whom all things have their very being. And here Moses is doxologically, as we would say, extolling that very fact. And so on the back of that, he says in verse 25, "Let me therefore, I pray, cross over and see the good land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon." Now we've cross-referenced this before, earlier, and we're not going to go through the whole passage here. Hearkening back to Numbers chapter 20, wherein the people are thirsty, they are crying out to God for water, they are borderline complaining, but they are indeed calling to God for water. And God explains, to paraphrase the story, in Numbers 20 there, Aaron, Moses, go forth. Moses, take the staff of Aaron, speak forth to this rock, and water shall come forth from it. Now there's a whole, again, speaking of typology like I mentioned earlier, This is all designed as a very important biblical symbolism, pointing forward to who Christ would be and what he would do, that from him fountains of living water would come forth. It ties into all kinds of prophetic texts that come later, especially in Ezekiel, and water flowing forth from the temple out to the lands and so on and so forth. The concept of water throughout the scripture is actually a very interesting study. But instead what happens there is that Moses, in his ultimately anger, frustration, often with the people, in fairness to Moses, deserved, but nonetheless his frustration and anger, and as well as on the basis of that, an element of pride that unfortunately creeps in, takes the staff and instead of speaking forth to the rock, takes it and smashes it twice. Okay, you have to read between the lines. It's pretty clear that's in anger, and says, "Do we have to bring forth this water for you, you rebels?" Okay. Now, the generous interpretation of that would be that when he says we, he's speaking of himself and Aaron. The less generous interpretation would be when he says we, he is saying me and God. Okay. That's a whole semantic debate, but point being, it doesn't really matter, because he is doing things with the authority of God. The power that he exercises in the world, which in any other time period would have been called magic, is done so on the authority of God. Not on the authority of demons, not on the authority of darkness. It is done so not even on his own authority, because outside of God he has none. True authority comes from exactly one source, God. Herein Moses does not do that. Instead, in anger, enraptured in probably a basis of pride in that moment as well, he decides to react in anger, even though God was not angry. God instead was not actually coming down in judgment upon the Israelites for their crying out for water, but was actually meant to be displaying great mercy and grace that Moses, and I say this from an earthly perspective, not from God's, ruins, inverted commas. Okay, this was meant to be a picture of grace and mercy coming forth from the rock, which God knew full well was going to be a typology or a symbol of Christ himself later, that Moses interjects himself into. The consequences of that is that he would not be allowed to enter the promised land with the people. Okay, because actions have consequences. Though our slate is wiped clean, our account has been redeemed in the eyes of God, we still live in a world where actions have consequences. And not only is that just merely okay, that's a good thing. Okay. And so here Moses, though, this is an important point to draw out here in Deuteronomy chapter 3. Moses doesn't have dementia. He knows full well what happened back in the day. He hasn't forgotten. So then the question might come, why on earth is he asking God for this? Right? Why is he saying, let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land that is beyond the Jordan, when he's already been told before that that was not going to happen? Right? You may think that's an odd request. This is one of the beautiful things, because really what it's not so much doing is talking about Moses here. It's actually talking about what comes immediately after, which is with regards to what God does. Moses still, and this is a good thing, Moses still in God, as his slave, as his servant, has the confidence, rightful confidence, not hubristic confidence, but rightful confidence, to approach God and to ask him for mercy. To ask him, in this case really to be more specific semantically, ask him for grace. We've explained before, but it's an important point to encapsulate here. Grace and mercy, okay, as concepts, but especially in regards to God, are kind of like two sides of the same coin. It's the analogy I've given you many times before. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. Okay, you deserve X, and the person who should be administering justice or the consequences relents on that. This is mercy. Okay, it's not getting what you deserve. Right? When you deserve judgment, when you deserve justice to face you. Grace, related to that, but rather the flip side of that proverbial coin, is being given something that you do not deserve. Okay? In the positive sense, not the negative. Being given something as a gift, even though you have done nothing to earn it. This here really is a demonstration of God's grace, of him being given something that he did not deserve. But the point you have to see here is that Moses, again, knowing what the judgment is, and not necessarily objecting to it either. This shouldn't be taken as Moses objecting or Moses complaining. This should be taken for what it is in the context of the passage. This is Moses having the confidence, having the faith, the trust, that when God has said throughout Moses' lifetime that he is merciful and he is gracious, that he is abounding in chesed, okay, steadfast love, redeeming mercy, to the 1,000th generation, right, a figure of speech, forever, that those words are true. Do you see? This is what Moses is doing. He's actually just believing God. He's believing that when God says that he is merciful and gracious, that he in fact is. Because he's already demonstrated this 1,000 times, and Moses knows better than anyone else that God has done that. He's not approaching God here out of arrogance. He's not approaching him out of some desire for getting what he thinks he deserves. No. Moses knows full well that he does not deserve to enter the promised land. But he is asking God for mercy. He's asking him for grace. Because God is indeed great in his faithfulness. And as the hymn says that we have indeed sung this morning, that morning by morning, new mercies we see. This is what he is doing. He's actually ironically testifying to the mercy and the grace of God. And that's exactly what he receives. Keep reading through verse 26. But Yahweh was angry with me. Don't let that hold you up. Read it in context. But Yahweh was angry with me on your account. Interesting phraseology. We'll get back to that. And would not listen to me. And Yahweh said to me, enough. Speak of me no more in this matter. Again, the judgment has come. He's reminding him of what the judgment is. But then see what happens in verse 27. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes to the west and to the north and to the south and to the east, and see it with your own eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. Now again, you can read the full context or the broader context of that in Deuteronomy chapter 34, which we had read earlier in the liturgy, and you can read that again after the sermon. But what you have is Moses taken up Mount Nebo, taken up upon the high mountain, and seeing the whole land, pretty good view from there as well, seeing the whole land, really at any mountainous point in and around where the mountain is. We're not 100% sure exactly which mountain it was, but any of those mountainous regions in the land, kind of between the Sea of Galilee to the north and even beyond that, down through to the land of the sea, of the Dead Sea, you have mountains which you can rose up upon. It's a very mountainous part of the world, and you can see the land around you. And he sees all that had been promised to Abraham nearly half a millennia ago. Right, and this is mentioned there in Deuteronomy chapter 34. This is the land that I promised to Abraham, to Isaac and to Jacob, this good and glorious land, which currently is marred with the curse of sin, which is poisoned by rebellion, by darkness, by evil, by paganism, okay, and the various wicked ways of man, that we and I shall redeem. And he sees this. This is an act of grace on God's part. He cannot enter the land. God's justice cannot just merely be undone. God is not one who sweeps things under the rug, okay, because justice, thank God, does not operate upon nice feelings. Justice is administered for justice's sake, because justice is all about righteousness. It's not about getting square, right? So it's not about revenge. It's rather about rightful vengeance. Two similar words, but they should not be confused. It is not merely retribution, but it is in fact rightful consequences for evil actions. Justice cannot be swept under the rug. We do not believe, as the ancient pagans did, that indeed things can be done wrong in this world, and that the gods, through what essentially amounts to just trickery and deception, can pull some abracadabra, or could just completely ignore concepts of justice and in fact do some more evil and trickery and deception in order to bring an advantage for their favoured hero. This is not who we worship. We do not worship a God who engages in tricks or who that employs arbitrary favouritism and who violates any concept of right and wrong in order to get some given outcome. No. We worship the God of truth. And the truth is defined by him, and it is indeed objective, therefore also is his justice. There's no sweeping under the rug. This is what God's reminding him of here. Right? Do not speak any more of this matter. I've told you what the consequences are. I've told you what my judgment is. Right? And rightfully so. And yet, he demonstrates this grace and mercy and takes him up upon the mountain to see the land. Right? This is doing 1,000 different things. One of the most important in the immediate context is it's really speaking to what the roles of even the greatest of the prophets are. And that is but a cog in the greater proverbial machine. Moses lives, Moses dies. We had that spoiled for us earlier when we read Deuteronomy chapter 34. They are not eternal in their mortal life. They live, they die. They can do great things and have done great things, and we read of the great and wondrous things that have occurred throughout history. But indeed, their part, no matter how great and mighty it is, and there's few who are greater than Moses, their part eventually comes to an end. They pass away, and yet does the whole enterprise, so it were, finish? No. Does the mission of God end? No. Okay, we had that last week, right, when we were reading through verses 12 through 22. We saw that indeed, although now, for example, the twin tribes of Ephraim had been able to settle in their land east of the Jordan, this was not party time. They were not to now kick up their feet and be fed grapes and just hang out. But instead, no, your men, your warriors, are to continue forth, and you will be part of the operation that crosses the Jordan. And you will not rest until all the people have settled in their lands. Okay, until the conquest and the victory is complete, until the evil that dwells in this land has been driven out. Your women, your children, your livestock shall remain here, and that is good and glorious. That is by God's design. But you shall continue forth on this mission. And so shall the successive generations. Because though we are finite, though we are mortal, God is not. Though we have an end in our mortal capacity, the mission of God continues forth. The Son of God indeed marches forth to war, and his banner continues to march forth through history. And this is what we really see, and we'll make this point by the time we get to the end when we circle back to Joshua, that we are but part. But one thing that I want to touch upon here is as Moses is taken up there in verse 27, and he sees the glorious nature of the land that was promised to his ancestor Abraham. This is a fascinating thing to see and understand, that Moses here looks forth and sees the land. He places his confidence and his faith and his trust that the mission of God will continue on through history and that it will be successful. He has that hope. And then we fast forward ourselves, roughly speaking, 1.5 millennia, upon the backs of millions upon millions upon millions, tens of millions of Israelites who have lived by this point by the time we arrive in the 1st century AD, who have constantly, kind of like Moses, been looking forward, placing their hope and their trust in this Yahweh who looks forward to the mission that will be completed. Their hope constantly being in the future. They have trust and confidence based on the past, obviously. They know what's happened. They've seen what Yahweh has done. They've seen the great and mighty works. That's what Moses says here in verse 24. But the ultimate hope they look forward to. The entirety of the Old Testament is a consistent thread of people looking forward to the ultimate hope. And then you arrive in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when that hope actually comes. When this great King of Kings indeed arrives. When this kingdom of God, to use the Lukean term, to use Matthew's term, the kingdom of heaven, those terms are synonymous, indeed comes and arrives. This is why the fundamental proclamation of John the Baptist, as well as Christ himself, the very first words out of their mouths, repent, for the kingdom of God has come, it is at hand, it literally has arrived. And this is encapsulated in no greater form than in the transfiguration of Christ himself. Right, and this is what we're going to cross-reference here now, because it's really important for you to see this. And so the transfiguration marks the center point, the proverbial axis, so it were, of the ministry of Christ. It comes just on the heels of him having been in Caesarea Philippi, upon the great mountain of the cave, above the cave of Pan, this gateway to Hades, to the underworld, this very deeply religious place, one of the most religious places in the ancient Near Eastern world at this time period in history. And it is upon that mountain, again another mountain, where Christ asks the disciples broadly, but especially Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter proclaims for the first time in this identifiable way, "You are the Christ, and you are the Messiah, you are the King, you're the Anointed One, the Son of the living God." Okay? This marks the first of three very obvious proclamations, kind of defining proclamations of the kingship and the deity of Christ. That's the first. The second major one comes at the hands of a pagan in the form of the Roman soldier at his crucifixion. Surely this man was the Son of God. Okay, when he is witnessing the death of the Messiah, this great earthquake which happens in Judea, which is recorded not only by the Jews but also by the Romans and other sources as well beyond the scriptures. He sees the terror and the awe of this, and surely this man is the Son of God. And then the third comes not long after that, on the heels, on the Sunday, when Christ appears physically to the disciples in the room. My patronymic namesake, Thomas, has, with all due respect, I'm going to defend his honour to the death here, thinks logically and rationally, which is good because we've been given those faculties. And with all due respect, a lot of you would have responded the same way, as we all would have, right? Where the disciples tell him the account given to them by John and Peter and of course Mary Magdalene and co, that the tomb's empty. Jesus is risen from the dead, right? And Didymos, to use his Greek name, Thomas, his Aramaic name, says, well, unless I see him and I see the nail marks in his hands and the spear wound in his side, you can't expect me to believe this, right? I'm paraphrasing. Right? Perfectly rational, logical response, which to 99% of instances is probably the correct response. Okay, if someone came up to you on the street and rushed up to you and told you the exact same story, you'd go, cool. And you would go, unless I see it, I don't believe, right? That's why I dedicate my life to dismantling the doubting Thomas moniker. A rightful doubt, an understandable doubt, more like it. But then Christ appears, and ironically, who is it that is the one who says, "Kyrios kai theos mu," my Lord and my God? Didymos, Thomas. Okay. It's the first time that he's been called that. That is the most divine term in the entire Gospels, for anyone who's wondering. Okay? Kyrios mu, my Lord, right? Kyrios is the word which is obviously describing a Lord, but that's the word in Greek that is used to translate the divine name Yahweh. It's not just merely, it's part of this, it's not just merely my ruler or my overlord, which is what Kyrios contains, right? So a magistrate or a prince or a king can be called Kyrios. The patriarch of a household can be called Kyrios in Greek. It's more than that. That's the term that's used to translate God's name from the Old Testament. Do you understand? It's a distinctively divine moniker in the New Testament. And kai theos mu, my God. That's fairly self-explanatory. Thomas does this upon seeing. And it's in that instance that he says, "You have seen me," right? "But have you believed?" And he then says, of course, that famous phrase, "Blessed are those who believe, yet who have not seen." Okay? Because this is what we get to in the Transfiguration. If you want to turn with me to Luke chapter 9, I'll read the Luke's account of it. All three of the synoptic Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, account the Transfiguration. Fascinatingly, John does not, even though John was one of the people there. There's a whole bunch of speculation as to why that's the case. But nonetheless, it's also potentially because it was well accounted for in the synoptics already, and John had other priorities. But nonetheless, in Luke chapter 9, we're just going to read through verses 28 to 36 to remind you. We're not going to go into a deep exegesis because that would be, it wouldn't be a sermon, that would be a sermon series, which I'll spare you from at this point. So Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. We'll read it through. I'll point out one or two things, and then I'll get you to the real cross-reference, which is part of our exegesis here. Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. Now it happened some 8 days after these words. These words are what I mentioned earlier. The Petrine proclamation, okay, Peter's proclamation at Caesarea Philippi above the cave of Pan and above the gates of hell, the gates of Hades that Christ talks about. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay, and then Christ says to Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock, the rock of the proclamation, by the way, I shall build my church, and the gates of Hades, the underworld, the gates of death, shall not overcome it. He's saying that while literally standing above the gates of Hades he's talking about. In terms of the pagan religious cult, kind of cultus context. So 8 days after that, again, that has significance of Christ being raised on the 8th day, as we colloquially call it, right? The Sunday, the first day of the week. Now, it happened some 8 days after these words that taking along Peter and John and James, who were kind of the, I say this colloquially, inner sanctum of the disciples, he went up upon the mountain to pray. And it happened that we're not told what mountain, but I'll circle back in a minute as to what it likely is. And it happened that while he was praying, he appeared, so the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now, there's a couple of things here. Again, we're not deeply exegeting this, but I'm going to give you a couple of things. One, historically throughout the church, and there's a very good reason, and there's a good reason for thinking this, by the way, most believing New Testament scholars also hold this view as well. This mountain is likely Mount Hermon. Okay? That has, I could be here all day talking about the significance of Mount Hermon. But Mount Hermon was an extremely important place in the pagan context, particularly Amorites. The ancient Amorite context. There's in the very Amorites like Sihon and of Og that we've just been working through with Deuteronomy. Okay, Mount Hermon was to them in many respects, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but in many respects what like Mount Olympus was to the Greeks. It was the residing place where the gods dwelt. Okay, this was Mount Hermon, right? It's featured in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a very important Babylonian text. It's featured in Ugaritic texts, which are important to the Amorites specifically. Very important place, right, for the pagans. And it's here upon Mount Hermon that Christ is revealed in his glory. Okay, that's extremely important, right? That's why Mount Hermon is almost certainly where it is. It makes sense, especially the way that Mark words it in his chapter. There's an indication that it's probably Mount Hermon there as well. And what you have here is Moses and Elijah appearing. Okay, Moses, the embodiment of the law, representative of the law. Elijah, the embodiment and representation of the prophets. Right, so the law and the prophets, the common designation for what the Old Testament is. Right, the law and the prophets. And these are the two figures which embody that and which represent that in its fullest extent. And interestingly, and this is the third little point that I'll make here, in verse 31, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure. The word there in Greek, departure, exodos, as in Exodus. Okay, the word for the book of Exodus is actually, it's not a Hebrew name, it's the Greek name. Okay, just like we explained this at the very first week, but Deuteronomy, Deuteronomion, right, the second law. Okay, exodos, meaning departure. Okay, there's a different Hebrew term for it in Hebrew, obviously in the Old Testament. Exodus is the Greek term, that's why we call it that based on the book. Okay, his departure. So here, this is now obviously Luke interjecting and Luke making account in verse 31. They were speaking of his exodus, so it were, his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Okay, this is in the context of his death, by the way. Okay, that's what's come immediately before this text, if you go back through Luke. And his exodus, his death, is what's being spoken of. Now again, the fullness of what that means would be sermons. Okay, but just pointing it out. So continuing through in verse 32. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, right? This is indicating to us that the transfiguration actually occurs at night time. And when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and two men standing with him. And it happened that they were leaving him, it happened that as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And then this is Luke interjecting, not realizing what he was saying. He doesn't get what's going on here, the significance of this particular event. While he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered this cloud. Again, this is the exact same imagery, the exact same thing that we see all the way back in the kind of text that we're talking about, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, blah, blah, where God appearing on the mountain of Sinai to Moses. There is lightning, there is thunder, there is fire, there is smoke. Okay? All of this is the eminence of God's power, of his glory as he appears, right? And there's important typological imaging going on. This is an extremely obvious sign that this is God. Okay? And in verse 35, a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." Okay, one of the few times in which the Father actually speaks of the Son throughout the Gospels. Probably the most famous one before this, of course, is at Jesus' baptism. "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." Okay? All of this is hearkening back to the kind of verbiage and phraseology which you see, for example, in probably one of the most famous parts is Psalm 2, okay, where indeed the Father speaks to this one who is called the Son in that text. Again, speaking of this exact encounter, or speaking of encounters like this, right? "You are my son, today I have begotten you," right? Not in the physical, biological sense, begotten in terms of status. "You are the one who I have made unique. You are the unique one." Okay? "Ask of me and I shall make the nations your inheritance and all the earth your heritage." Okay? This is fulfilled, we're told, by this very same Apostle Peter, by the way, who was here at the Transfiguration, that these things, like Psalm 2, were fulfilled in the resurrection. Okay? In fact, he points to that very explicitly and harkens back to that on the day of Pentecost. That indeed Christ inherited the nations and all the earth became his possession upon his resurrection. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. He reigns and rules over all things. Right? The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, to use phraseology from elsewhere in the New Testament. This is who Christ is. And this is being demonstrated here in but this brief moment, so it were, in the transfiguration. Okay? What Greek-speaking Christians would call metamorphosis, the transformation. Okay? Where Jesus is shown in his full divinity. Right? Unencumbered by anything. Without humbling of himself in his humanity. This is the full revelation. He's still very much human, but it's the full divine and glorious state of who he is as the God-man, as we would say in English. And then when the voice had spoken, verse 36, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. Why? Because the time was not yet to reveal this. Right? These things were being demonstrated, but the full revelation would come when? At Pentecost. When for the first time this is all explained. Right? And you see how this plays out. Because now Christ has been risen from the dead by the time you get to Acts chapter 2, and hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people have seen him. Now you might think, why on earth are we cross-referencing the Transfiguration? Well, there's a whole host of reasons, which again, if we went through the full depth of them, would be a sermon series in its own right. But the fundamental premise that I'm tying you back to here in regards to Deuteronomy chapter 3 is this. Moses is taken high up on the mountain to look out and to see a land that he would not himself inherit. Right, that he would not enter. Okay? But that rather those who come after him, those who follow after him, the successive generations, like especially Joshua, who would lead them, who was going to be his successor, that they would go forth. And then eventually Joshua himself would also meet his end. And then successively, the plan of God's great redemption in this world would continue on. Okay? And so Moses is looking forward in hope. Do you understand what I'm laying out for you here? He's looking forward in hope. Ultimately, in the most ultimate sense, truly, to exactly what is actually being seen here upon yet another mountain in its full array. This is why John, in his prologue, says that the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made a tabernacle among us. He literally tabernacled among us, right, in his flesh, the humanity of Christ serving as a tabernacle for his divinity, right, in which he dwelt. And we beheld his glory, glory as of from the Father, full of grace and of truth. We beheld his glory. When John's saying that, you have to remember that as philosophical as that sounds, and it is, it's very high and exalted philosophy there. He's speaking to something which he literally saw. We beheld his glory. He's not even speaking we corporately here, as in like our Christians saw his glory. When he says we, he's actually part of the we. He's part of the we in that context. We saw his glory because he saw this. Do you understand? When John writes his prologue, there is exactly two other people in the world who are as eminently qualified to write that prologue. Do you understand? Namely, Peter and James. Those are the three which saw this. He is eminently qualified. If you want an explanation of how can we believe the scriptures, just to get on a very brief hobby horse here, if you want an explanation or an understanding of how can we believe this, how about someone who was there? How about someone who, when you're getting that very profound philosophical exposition in John chapter 1 verses 1 through 18, the prologue of John's Gospel, and you're hearing something that would have fascinated men like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and some of the greatest minds that ever walked the ancient world. This man saw this. When he says we beheld his glory, he literally means we beheld his glory. When he then finishes that prologue by saying, no one has seen God, semicolon, the only begotten God, the monogenes, the unique one, the unique God, he has exegeted him. Literally, he has revealed him, he has made him known. So he does something that's just remarkable in a biblical text. No one has seen God. We get told that 1,000 times in the Old Testament. Because God is spiritual, he's not material. The divine essence is not material like we are, or like the physical world you see around you. You shouldn't expect to see it. Okay? It's not some convoluted hocus pocus that we can't see God in that sense. No, it's an actual ontological reality. We shouldn't expect to see spiritual things because they don't have a material form. But, John says, the unique one, this title, the monogenes, the only begotten God, he has exegeted him. Like I'm exegeting these scriptures now on an infinitely more important way. He reveals God. Hence why Christ is able to say, if you have seen me, you have seen God. Because now, in the incarnation, everything's changed. God, who had not been seen, who had merely been heard, whose presence had been felt, whose eminence had been seen but not God himself, so fire and smoke and thunder, all the kinds of things which you would expect at the bare minimum to occur if the eternal creator of the world, the very one who spoke atoms into existence, actually appeared. But yet without seeing him, you now have in this scenario here, Christ himself, that very divine one, physically appearing in every true sense of the word physical, because now he is also human. This is the ultimate sense of the hope. This is the ultimate hope which is looked forward to, that now is no longer looked forward to, because for the very authors like Peter or like John, it's now standing right in front of them. I hope you're seeing the gravity of what I'm pointing to here. Yes? Are you understanding the absolute incomparable weight of what I'm referring to? They looked forward in hope, like Moses himself looked forward and out upon the promised land, to land that had not yet been redeemed. And he had faith and hope that it will be, and that indeed not just that land, but as the prophets go on to say, that indeed the whole world, that like God said to Abraham, through you all the nations of earth shall be blessed. This very hope was now standing right in front of John, right in front of James, right in front of Peter. And so one of the most eminently qualified people again to speak on that is Peter. Why don't we turn there? Turn me to 2 Peter chapter 1. It's a short text, but it speaks to exactly what we're referring to here. 2 Peter chapter 1. For context, Peter here is writing his first and second epistles. He's writing it to really a group of people, but it's a group of people particularly in places like Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia Minor, so the lands of where churches like Colossae, the Galatians, which is a region or an ethnic group, the churches of Asia Minor, which you'll be familiar with particularly from some of the epistles, of course, like Ephesians, for example, but also more broadly from chapters 2 and 3 of the Revelation, given to John, so churches like Pergamum, Smyrna, Thyatira, Philadelphia, etc., etc. He's writing to a consortium of churches. This was going to be passed around the broader region that is Asia Minor. Okay? And he's writing it somewhere in the mid to late 60s, in the last couple of years of his life. We know that by virtue of the way that he speaks in certain portions of those two epistles about him having him knowing when his death is coming. He can sense that death is near because he, like the Apostle Paul, both die in the Neronic persecution, so the persecution that occurs under Nero between about, roughly speaking, 64 to 68 AD, okay, in the last years of the Emperor Nero, who was a tyrant. They both die in that. He's writing it in these last couple of years, so let's just call it somewhere between about 65 to 68 AD. Okay? Here's what he says in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 to 18. He's ultimately speaking here and recounting to these various churches of Asia the transfiguration. Verse 16, for we did not make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ following cleverly devised myths. Okay? Translation into modern English, we're not making this up. This is not just some convoluted kind of pyramid scheme that we're all trying to get you on to become wealthy or powerful or famous, because we all died in poverty and destitution and we died horribly. Right? If it was a pyramid scheme, it was the biggest failure of a pyramid scheme in history. We're not coming to you with cleverly devised myths, with fables, with made-up stories. Instead, but being eyewitnesses to his majesty. This is what sets the Bible apart from every other religious text. It is not the philosophical musings of some guy in a cave. It is not a man going up onto a hillside and contemplating the beauty of nature and of the universe and bringing down from the mountain some lovely sounding philosophy. It is not a consortium of myths and fables that have kernels of truth, but whose accounts are greatly exaggerated. This is, in fact, history. These are eyewitnesses. No, and nothing in the Gospels pretends anything else to the contrary of that. Does that make sense? Okay? These are eyewitnesses, and they put that forward. Hundreds of people have seen the resurrected Jesus. It's not just Peter who saw Christ transfigured, it's Peter, James, and John. Okay, so it's not just one, it's three. Do you understand? All of that's vitally important. They're eyewitnesses. And if we're bringing you cleverly devised myths, it's extremely easy to demonstrate this didn't happen. Just go find the body in the tomb. That's it. Done. Our whole little scheme here will be over. The ruse will be up. We'll be found out to be nothing more than charlatans. But wait. The tomb's empty. And the tomb's empty to this very day. Okay? He's not there. Why? Because shock horror, 500 plus people were not lying. They're actually telling the truth. Okay? And we have every reason, logically, rationally, faithfully and otherwise, to believe them. We did not come with cleverly devised myths, but being eyewitnesses of his majesty, in a literal sense in the Transfiguration. Why? In verse 17, for when he received honour and glory from God the Father, such an utterance, right, such speech or proclamation, as this was made by him, So to him, by the majestic glory. The majestic glory was a common title of God by the time you get to the first century. Not throughout the Old Testament, but through the intertestamental period into the first century. The majestic glory is a title like the Most High God, for example. Okay, and here's what the majestic glory, i.e. Yahweh, says. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Okay, and he's encapsulating the broader context of what we get when you account or piece together Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. Okay, he's accounting to them what they had seen. This great hope which Moses, literally and figuratively, looked out and forward to, they had now seen. They had now realized. It had now come and happened in their very day, before their very eyes. And Peter gives an encouragement. He gives an encouragement actually back in 1 Peter chapter 1. I'll just read it to you briefly because by the time you turn, that'll be finished. Verses 8 and 9, he says of 1 Peter chapter 1, so it's in the introduction of his first epistle to the churches of Asia. And though you have not seen him, friend of Christ, yet you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe in him, right, Pistion, you have trust, you have faith, you have confidence in him, you rejoice with joy inexpressible and glorious, receiving as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. Okay, he's encouraging these early Christians throughout the broader region of Asia Minor, or throughout the region of Asia as a whole. You haven't seen him. You've heard our eyewitness accounts, and you have faith that's not blind faith, because it would be blind faith if Peter and co came to them with cleverly devised myths. That's why Peter makes that point. Do you understand? He's coming to them, well, they, plural, hundreds of people are going around the world now with eyewitness accounts, independently verifiable eyewitness accounts. We all saw the same thing. If a trial happened today, a proverbial, trial of the century, as things get dubbed often now and then in the media, and there was questions as to whether or not this actually happened, and the Crown strolls in 500 eyewitnesses to this murder, one might be tempted to call that a slam dunk. There's not a single case in the world that would be speculative or that would get thrown out, or that the jury would be umming and ahhing for days on end if 500 people, independently verifiable, said they saw this. And yet people stand around confused or wondering as to whether or not, did this really happen? Right? At that point, you don't actually care to know, you don't want to know. You don't want to follow because of the implications, especially morally, that come. Because if this is true, and hundreds of people were not lying to you, then indeed, as independently verifiable, not just from the 500, but even more broadly beyond that as well, throughout when you take the whole story into account, then indeed that has implications in our world. But the point I'm circling to here is this. Blessed are those who have faith yet have not seen. But it's not like Moses. It's not like David. It's not like the major or the minor prophets of old. Their faith is incredible because they're looking forward. And don't get me wrong, they've seen things before, but it's all hinging upon a promise made to Abraham. And they know that they are looking forward in hope. Here now, that hope has arrived. The one who fulfills the Abrahamic covenant indeed arrived. This one who was the final in the line of kings that would come from Abraham, the one who is the hope, through whom the nations of the earth would be blessed, he had now come, and he had revealed himself in all array of glory. He did it in the transfiguration. He did it again, of course, then now upon his resurrection, being resurrected in his glory. And then they saw him. And indeed, the implication of the text is not worded in this specific way, but the broader implication when you read between the lines, no one missed the ascension of Christ. Jerusalem would have seen him. ascending from the Mount of Olives. This wasn't some secret esoteric event in the middle of the night, right? A very public, visible ascension into heaven. And in the second coming, when our Messiah returns, which is our blessed hope, no one will miss it either. We look back in hope. We also look forward in hope. But the distinct advantage and the great blessing, undeserved, that we have is that as we look forward in hope, the redemption of God's people throughout history, reconciling the nations to himself, everything that the new covenant has this great blessing of, we do it whilst being able to look back and having seen this happen. So that's why, as this passage finishes here in verse 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy 3, if you flip back there with me now as well, this great encouragement is the command given by Yahweh to Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 28 and 29, Yahweh speaking to Moses, "But command Joshua and strengthen him and encourage him, for he shall go across at the head of his people, and he will cause them to inherit the land which you will see." And the land which you see but do not enter, he will lead them. And you, in confidence and faith, will hand over this mantle. And by the time you get to the end of Deuteronomy, like you have in chapter 34, Moses does this confidently, hope-filled, faithfully. There's no begrudgingly handing over the proverbial mantle to Joshua. There's no envy. There's no bitterness. There's no jealousy. No, none of it. Moses ends as strong as he possibly could, right? That we'll eventually talk about when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 34 in, 15 years' time. When we eventually get there. What you have is confidence. And this is the point I want to leave you on here, especially in regards to this idea in verse 28 and 29. One of the defining marks of Christians throughout church history has been the consistent and loyal faith which they have had that God would indeed fulfill his promises. That might seem like an obvious statement, but I want you to see why it's not as obvious. As the gospel is going forth into the world, this isn't just the people dwelling in the land. It's not even the people of God moving into a singular land like Canaan is, right? At its fullest, it's one place on earth, and it's really not a big place either, okay? Now the gospel in the new covenantal context is going forth into all the world, which even in the known world of their day is just orders of magnitude greater than just this comparatively tiny land of Canaan. Okay? Going out into all the known world in their day is the entire Mediterranean world, as far away as Britannia, all the way across, even beyond the Roman Empire, to the lands beyond the Parthian Empire, to the land of the Indus Valley in India, right, which is where Thomas the Apostle goes. All of this distance, right? Let alone the fuller extent of the world, right? And of the entire globe now today. An exorbitantly greater and far higher and wider in magnitude task than just conquering this sliver of land in what we will call the Middle East called Canaan. Do you understand? All of the apostles die gruesomely under heavy persecution at the hands of one of the most evil men that has ever walked the face of the earth, the Emperor Nero. From a mortal perspective, they would have had an almost infinite list of reasons to be completely pessimistic. Do you understand? Every possible reason. They've planted some churches, and they're under heavy persecution, and the flame of those churches, it's entirely possible that they might be snatched out from right beneath us. That's the mortal perspective, okay? And yet what happens? It spreads like wildfire. 300 years later, roughly speaking, the Roman emperors, for the first time in history, start converting to Christianity. Constantine, Theodosius the Great, etc., etc. Right? Rome repents of its state paganism. Christianity is first legalized and then is made the official religion of the empire. A necessary step, by the way. Rome had to repent of her imperial institutional paganism. Christianity grows, but then the Western Empire collapses. Oh no, it's the end of the world, we're done, we're toast, this is really it. I know people have been saying this for hundreds of years before us, but this is really the end. And then the West collapse, and is it the end of the world? No. What happens is Christianity blossoms once again, like crushing a flower. All the petals and all the pollen just poof, explodes and spreads around. And this is exactly what's been happening. All the great cathedrals you can see around the world, especially in places like Europe, none of the people that built those, that started building those, ever saw them finished. Do you understand? Okay? Westminster Abbey, Lincoln Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral, Notre Dame, Cologne Cathedral. Pick any great cathedral, any wonderful testimony to the glory and majesty of God. None of the people that began those projects saw the end of it. At the minimum, what does that require? It requires, among many other things, a fundamental faith and trust that there will actually be Christians around after I die, who will continue to build, who will continue to flourish in the faith, who will continue to bring the reign and rule of Christ into all nations. Do you understand? Those cathedrals are one of the most obvious examples to the testimony of exactly what I'm talking about. That's why he trusts that Joshua will do what God has destined him to do. When times seem dark, when times seem like we can't see past our own current circumstance, we should have the exact same faith that all of our predecessors, all of our ancestors have also shared in, that God fulfills his promises, that God is faithful to the 1000th generation, that his grace and his mercy extend to all those whom he is calling unto himself. That indeed Christ does reign and rule over all the nations. He has inherited all things. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and he reigns and rules over all. And that we are to go out and to bring rebels under the banner of Christ, which is rightfully his. The way this draws implication is for your own children's children. How often do you think about your descendants? Do you pray for them? Do you think about where your family will be in 100 years' time, in 200 years' time, in 300 years' time? How often have you ever, if ever, prayed for the blessing, the well-being, and for the faith of your grandchildren's grandchildren? Because that's the kind of faith and vision that our predecessors and our ancestors had. That's what endured the Christian church, the Christian faith, through times that, quite frankly, are even darker than ours at the moment. That's the faith that sustained them. They had a godly, biblical understanding and vision and hope for the future. And we will continue to survive, and not just survive, but thrive, if that's also the faith and the vision that we have. Not built on cleverly devised myths, to use Peter's term, but built on facts, built on eyewitness account, built on truth and of faith in the God who is the definition of truth. Amen.